My name is Fabrizio Carmignani. I'm a professor of economics, and as a professor of economics, I'm going to test all of you on whether you have read the report or not. So be prepared for some sort of assignment. Thank you very much to our speakers for their interventions. I will start by asking a question, and then, of course, I will open the floor to the public for additional questions. My question is for all of you. Now, we've been talking a lot about inequality of opportunities and what we can do to achieve more equality of opportunities. But then my question is, once we have done all what we can do to achieve equality of opportunities, or as much as possible equality of opportunities, do we just have to accept any inequality of outcomes? Or there is a role for the community, for the government, in terms of reducing the inequality of outcomes? And if there is, what is the main tool that we can use, the main policy, the main action that we can use to address inequality of outcomes? In the end, when we talk about inequality, we often look at outcomes. The Gini coefficient is inequality of outcomes. So the question is, what do we do after we have tried to achieve equality of opportunities to ensure less inequality of outcomes?
Where do you want to start?
From you.
Okay, I'll start. No, we don't just accept any inequalities of outcome. The reason we're focused on equality of opportunity is because it's an essential precondition. But there are a couple of areas which are worth thinking about. Firstly, there are certain basic requirements in terms of health, education, and other primary goods as outcomes, where if they're not achieved within a reasonably narrow margin, you deny the opportunity and therefore in itself as a result of an outcome to participate fully in the society in which you're in. So if somebody said, look, we're going to put in place a law in which everybody with red hair is denied an equal level of education in terms of the outcome that they're going to achieve within a band, you'd be denying those people an essential opportunity to be able to participate as citizens. The second area where I think you've got to think about equality of outcomes is in terms of what is a just relativity. So a lot of people, for example, look at executive remuneration and they ask, in this country, let alone in America where the differences are far greater, how can you explain that there's thousands of times more value being created by one individual as the CEO from the other people who are contributing to the active enterprise as it unfolds? And it leaves for people a sense that there's something fundamentally wrong in the system. So I'd say on reasons to do with justice, let alone the consequences of injustice, there are some barriers there which we need to look at, and they have to be addressed by boards of directors, investors. There's a whole range of actors who can have an influence on that. I think there are outcomes in terms of basic things around health and education which are enabling states for citizens, where governments have to look at that and make sure that the basic minimums are achieved, not just at the level of opportunity, but at outcome levels as well.
Thank you. Any of the speakers would like to?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak. I guess, Fabrizio, in relation to your question, there are so many shades of inequality and so many variances and degrees of inequality, and one person's inequality sometimes is another person's not inequality. They don't see it that it is unequal. And I use as an example, I've spent all my life fighting inequality in the workplace for women in the workplace. Where we are, what we're paid, the wages gap. I've spent all my life working, scratching my head about, how is it that you have a union, for example, or a profession that is 96% female, and yet 50% of those occupying the highest occupations are male versus female. These type of issues are at various degrees depending on which kind of inequality we're talking about. And I don't know whether in my lifetime we're ever going to solve the inequality outcomes. I think we are always going to find shades of inequality. But what we have to do as a government is obviously have the research, the material, the information such as what we've been presented, that where we can address it, have the laws in place that prevent it from occurring, have the policies in place where we can address it, and just continue to work hard to do what we can to raise and to address inequality wherever we find it. And look, that's a lifelong task for some of us, but I don't think we're ever going to get to the end. I think there will always be some shade of inequality somewhere that we have to work towards, and we've got to do it all together and address it. And for example, it's probably out there a bit, but the marriage inequality debate in this state, how fantastic that finally that inequity was addressed in Australia. You know, long time overdue, but we finally got there.
Thank
So
you.
you can achieve it.
Yeah.
Jared.
I'd probably answer this question by casting back. So we've actually had increasing wage inequality in this country. The reason that that hasn't shown up more in the income inequality statistics that I showed today is because we have a progressive tax system at the personal income level. So that's been a very important factor in that. If I contrast that with the United States, where obviously income inequality is higher, they've also just recently, in amongst other tax reform, introduced personal tax cuts, which if you look at them are actually quite regressive. So I think that the personal income tax system is incredibly important in terms of the outcomes that we seek.
Thank you. So let me now open to the audience. If you raise your hand, and you can introduce yourself and ask your questions. Yes, please.
John Cole from the Institute for Resilient Regions at the University of Southern Queensland. While you were talking, the ABS released population figures for Australia today. Of the 388,100 new Australians that joined us in the year to June 30 this year, or to June 30, 2017, I should say, over 70% have joined Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. How important is a regional development and decentralisation strategy, somehow evenly delivered between the Federation? How important is it to addressing and ensuring we actually do something with inequality in Australia? Starting, Simon, with your recollections of being in the Pilbara just last week.
I think what we need to do is to allow people to know about the pull factors for a start that exist in regional Australia. I mean, nearly every fantastic story you hear about migrants flourishing comes out of the regions, where communities have welcomed them, found jobs for people to do, have seen them become extraordinarily valued contributors to those communities. So part of the challenge, I think, in response to those statistics is to let those people who arrive as migrants to know what an extraordinary range of opportunities already exist within the areas where they have. Now, beyond that, I would be creating incentives by making sure that those things are reinforced in the regions. It's not working well in the very large cities at the moment to see them bursting at the seams. It's stoking a kind of xenophobia in some areas, and there are genuine problems with planning and infrastructure in the big cities. So it does no one a favour to have people put into a cauldron or a crucible in which tensions rise and the system starts to struggle under the strain that this produces. And so why not make the most of the virtuous opportunities that exist in the regions by incentives, but also by information? And I think providing people feel safe where they're going, and that they get that, if you like, that staging post where they settle in, they find like-minded people within their communities, then as long as there's some kind of pathway for transition into the regions, there's great merit in what I think you're implying should be done.
Thank you.
Yeah. Look, I'm not surprised by the statistic. I'm surprised it's actually not higher, that they're staying in the major towns. And I guess it is all about opportunities. And I think we can do more to say, that regional living is fantastic in Australia, but, how do you get that message across? How do you incentivise people. I think as Simon was talking, to get them out in the country. And I think about my dad when he came out in the early 50s. They settled in Brisbane. My mother came out 2 years later because Dad had to save up to get the fare to bring her out. And interesting, he didn't spend his time in Brisbane. He was a barber, trained, and he worked out how many heads of hair he'd have to cut to get my mother's, travel amount. And he thought, this is no good. And he actually went to the regions to make the money. And he went cane cutting in Babinda. And one of my prized possessions is a photo of him in the cane fields, cutting cane, with his little Italian gang at the time. And I take that everywhere with me to remind me about where I've come from. And he made his money in Babinda and in Dirranbandi, where he was working for the Winter family in Dirranbandi, doing whatever odd jobs that he could do. And he said that the difference in wages were like something like 3 to 4 times. So there was an incentive for them to go into the regions. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case, and wages are sort of, a bit difficult. So it's interesting how things have changed. But yeah, we need to probably do more to demonstrate that regional and remote living is pretty good in Australia. And, developing, of course, and we're working very much in working with the regions to bring the economic opportunities to attract those workers there.
Thank you. Sharon, if I can engage you as a follow-up, do you think that a more flexible labour market would be a way to address geographical inequalities?
Wow.
Sorry. and by flexible, I mean a labour market where there is an opportunity for workers to move across sectors and to move across regions.
Yep.
That's the notion of flexibility I have in mind.
Okay. Yep. And I think certainly the data on this, interestingly, even kind of post, when we had the investment boom in resources, people still weren't moving. So even interstate migration was not something that has typically occurred at a rapid rate. I mean, I do think that the real question, I think, is what is the incentive? What is it that will make people move? And I think there's a lot of, yes, there's some economic things there, but there's also some big cultural and kind of family reasons why I think people don't move. The other thing that, speaking to a lot of companies last year, was now that we have dual income households, it's not such a simple equation about where to move and when. You've kind of got two people to worry about in terms of career, and that makes that decision a lot more tricky, I think, in terms of mobility. So I'd be loath to kind of suggest one kind of mechanism, but I do think it's an important question and something that we clearly have not kind of cracked the nut on.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do I have another question? Over there.
Hi, Laura Doonan, economist at Seqwater. Jared, in particular, what are your thoughts on the proposed Turnbull government company tax cut, particularly in light of Stiglitz's recent comments?
So, not surprisingly, I was asked this question on Friday as well. The debate on company tax seems to have moved very much into talking a lot about jobs and wages. Why do you do a company tax cut? You do it to affect investment, and that effect will be different according to different companies and their structures and so forth. But we seem to have gone out ahead of that and looking at kind of the secondary effects in terms of jobs and wages. So I think the debate has kind of gone a bit off the rails in that respect. But also I think it's prevented us from having a bigger, broader debate about tax reform, which we've had a couple of goes at this now between the Henry Tax Review and more recent kind of papers. So that, I guess the disappointing thing for me is that we're not having that bigger, broader discussion, and particularly in terms of some of the things that we're talking about today in terms of the whole tax base and how you maintain a sustainable tax base over the longer term is really, I think, where we're missing a big opportunity at the present time.
But the killer statistic that Stiglitz quoted was that percentage of the tax cut that's flown back into the hands of shareholders through share buybacks in the US. It's an extraordinarily high percentage. And although we've got widespread share ownership through superannuation funds here in Australia, I think if that was the principal effect that took place here, which is how that tax cut was used, that would leave a very bad taste in the mouth of the community, I think, which has been led by the politicians to expect that a large-scale corporate tax cut will generate, whether it's jobs or wages, that it will be a more profound public benefit rather than a selective benefit to a few.
I guess without getting too political, in politics timing is everything, and I guess I find the timing very curious at the moment with what we're hearing, and I think Simon's hit the nail on the head. I think community expectation is one that really needs to be addressed here, and I don't think the community expects that this is done, particularly when the evidence suggests that what they say will occur often does not occur.
We have one more question. I think that this might be the last one.
Dominic Late. Question that relates to, I guess, the unpaid work. So we've read enough research about the unpaid work at home and that the females are, proven to be doing a lot more than their male colleagues. And then we have the inequity in pay as well. So as a solo mother, and I have a colleague who's with me today who's also the same, I also know some male colleagues who are also solo parents. There seems to be a different view of my male colleagues versus my female colleagues about, gee, aren't they champions versus it's expected. How do we address that more broadly?
I've spent my life trying to work to address that. Look, it's just a cultural thing that we need to continually be persistent at working at. I mean, that's really all I can say. And my only experience is when I turned up with my daughter when she was little to a playgroup or a childcare centre, and the difference when my husband, Michael, turned up. And he was seen as, oh, wonderful, Michael's at the playgroup, the only male there, oh, he's so great. Here am I working the full-time job, taking her, and it was just seen as the norm. Look, I don't know, I guess we've got to continually be persistent. I think that we are working at it, it's chipping away, but it's clearly a cultural attitude to the role of women in society. And I actually put that down to all the ailments that women have, the role that is perceived by society that we have. Now, is that changing? Of course. For me, is it changing fast enough? No. Are we working away at it? We certainly are. But I know exactly what you've experienced and talked to a lot of my other female colleagues are in exactly the same boat. If we could answer that question and address those issues, we'd go a long way to addressing the inequality between men and women in this country.
Thank you very much. I think we have come to the end of our time. Please join me in thanking our three speakers once again.